Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this instalment I review Mike Leigh's historical epic, Peterloo. Set in 1819, the film charts the events leading up to the infamous Peterloo massacre, where a group of 60,000 people meeting in St. Peter's Field, Manchester to demand parliamentary reform, led by radical speaker Henry Hunt, played by Rory Kinnear, was attacked by government militias who wounded or killed many of the unarmed protesters. If you're not familiar with the work of Mike Leigh, he's a critically acclaimed filmmaker that is known for his improvisational style, and what I mean by that is that during pre-production he'll meet with the actors and workshop the film. He'll get them into character, have them develop their histories, perhaps more in depth than we ever see in the actual films themselves, and over the course of that particular process he'll work out where the story's going organically, and that's the point of it, because a lot of Leigh's films are very much character pieces and are quite intimate. And so that really works wonders, and it allows the actors to work out the characters' fates alongside the roles that they are playing and be surprised by them in much the same way. And I think that really works for Leigh, as clearly evidenced by the massive amounts of applause that he's got for numerous projects like Topsy Turvy, Secrets and Lies, Vera Drake, Naked, and most recently, Mr. Turner, the biopic of J.M.W. Turner that starred Timothy Spall, which was not only critically acclaimed, but also by far his most commercially successful film to date. And so, because of that, we now have Peterloo, which is inarguably his most ambitious film, covering a major historical event, but also with the biggest budget that he's ever been given at $14 million. A lot of that money comes from Amazon, in fact. They backed this movie somewhat surprisingly, and I think for a long time they considered it to be a major awards contender for them. Now, this is about a historical event that even Leigh didn't know about for a long time, and certainly I didn't know about it before the film, which is perhaps understandable because it's not a particularly proud moment in British history, so you can understand why it isn't being taught in history classes. But nevertheless, I think it is very important to make people aware of it, especially because it's coming up to the bicentenary of the event, and that was Leigh's thinking behind the project. He thought that this was very much the right time to tell this particular story. However, I don't think the film is wholly successful at what it does, and clearly I'm not the only one, because Amazon are releasing this in America, and originally they'd set the release date for November, at about the same time as its UK rollout. However, that's now changed, and it's now being released in April, which obviously sets it out of the awards season race. And so clearly what has happened there is that they've seen the movie and realised that maybe it wasn't quite the film that they really wanted out of it, I don't think. And I do believe that Peterloo really does test the limits of Leigh's approach and style when it comes to improvisation. Peterloo's credits prominently list a historian in them, and that, I think, is easily its greatest asset. The film does a fantastic job of recreating what life was like in the early 19th century, and really placing the audience in that particular point of time. It's not something that one would usually think about, but just seeing them go about their everyday business is actually some of the best moments in Peterloo. Seeing them do their shopping, picking up their everyday essentials, it seems at once very familiar, but also very different at the same time, and that's exactly what Leigh is trying to accomplish. However, it is worth remembering that we have actually progressed a long way since Peterloo. A lot of what they were campaigning for was parliamentary reform, because you have to remember that only 2% of the population could vote at this time, and what they wanted was local representatives or MPs. These were things that would be eventually granted with the Great Reform Act some years later, but those are things that we take for granted now, and this is a film that reminds us that no, actually, those were very hard-fought battles, literally, in this case. But what Leigh especially pushes is the parallels with how things are right now. A lot of the characters in this movie are struggling to put food on the table, jobs are scarce, prices are going up, and there are shortages. And this very much puts the viewer in mind of current day austerity Britain, where there is a significant chunk of the population that simply don't earn enough. They are reliant on food banks just to get by. And so Leigh is very critical of that. He very much chastises that disparity between the rich and the poor. And I think that that is very much represented in this film with the historic North and South divide when it comes to England. You have a number of scenes in London set in Parliament, and you contrast that with the scenes in Manchester with the everyday people. And so I think that if there is something to be learned from Peterloo, it's very much about what people in power will do once they feel their position is threatened, what lengths that they will go to, even if it means murder, even if it means getting blood on their hands. And I think that there is definitely parallels with how things are right now, when there is quite substantial inequality in general when it comes to society, and that's been kind of building up over a number of years. And so the ultimate message of this movie seems to be the more things change, the more they stay the same. As you can probably imagine, there is very much an anger flowing through this film, and I wish that exhibited itself more often, because it would have made for a much more compelling, much more engaging film that had a sense of momentum about it, which this crucially lacks, in my opinion. If I have to be honest, I found a lot of Peterloo to be a slog to get through. I think this is very much a case of a filmmaker becoming so invested in their subject they lose sight of the actual film itself. And when it comes to the editing of it, I think that Leigh kept in a lot of small moments, small details, and that's fine up until the point where it starts accumulating and the film starts to become bloated by it. This is a 2.5-hour movie, and I think that it tries to justify that length as being some kind of epic, and it does not need to, in my opinion. You could have told this story with half an hour, maybe even 45 minutes of cuts, because this feels very self-indulgent in places and not particularly well constructed. It doesn't feel like it flows particularly well. Pacing is non-existent. You would think that a movie like this would try and build up a head of steam. It would try and give you the sense of events eventually conspiring to this one major point, like a lot of dramas of historical nature do. This movie doesn't do that, and perhaps that was intentional on Leigh's part, because he does strive for authenticity and realism. His movies don't really have conventional narrative structures, and I can understand that, but at the same time, when you're dealing with something as expansive as this, you cannot do that. You do need to impart some level of narrative direction. Otherwise, it feels rudderless. It just simply feels like, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then this thing happened, and then that person appears, and then that person appears, which is exactly what happens in this movie. There will be scenes that suddenly cut from characters interacting with each other to someone just singing in a doorway quietly for 2 minutes, and I understand what that song is meant to represent, but you could have put it in a montage instead. You don't have to have us just linger on the doorframe of a character that we don't really know about. I'm pretty sure that was just a random extra. I don't know if that was actually one of the main characters. It's very hard to tell, because there are dozens of characters in Peterloo fighting for a little bit of screen time. He's trying to give you a sense of the wider perspective, just giving you these snatches of individual stories. You don't really really get a lot of time to actually even get to know the characters' names. There are a lot of historical figures in this film, but I really couldn't name them. The film doesn't really go into any real way of explaining who they are. It very much tries to shirk a lot of the easy hand-holding that a lot of these kind of films do, which I can commend it for trying to do, but it also justifies why a lot of films do that, because in this case, it just feels like nothing is really especially happening a lot of the time. There's a lot of really great actors in this movie, like Maxine, for example, but they're given very little in terms of characterization. You need people to actually connect with, and I think that one of the ways that the film, I think, really bungles this is that it does establish a couple of characters in the early stages as perhaps being key figures, like Joseph, for example. He is a soldier that has come back from the Napoleonic Wars, and he is clearly struggling with some kind of PTSD. He doesn't really speak very much, but in the opening stages of the film, there are these very dramatic shots of him walking home, walking over marshes by himself. Some beautiful cinematography all throughout this film, and you would think that they would use that as a way of signalling that this was a character of really great importance. And he sort of is in the first 15 minutes and the last 10 of the movie. However, the preceding 2 hours in between that, unfortunately, the screen time that he gets is him sitting in constant meetings. You just see him in crowd shots. And this comes back to another thing in that there's far too many speeches. The film has a lot of characters essentially soapboxing for their own causes, and that's how a lot of the characters are introduced. We cut to them in front of an audience, essentially all saying the same thing as each other. It's characters saying the same points again and again, just slightly reworded. We get it the first time, we get it the second time. By about the 6th or 7th time, we want you to move on with the story. I think the one real exception to this is Henry Hunt, played by Rory Kinnear, who was the speaker at St. Peter's Field when the attack occurred. In the second hour of the film, he starts to become quite prominent because he travels up to Manchester and stays with a local family to maintain a low profile, lest the authorities catch wind of his presence and try to kick him out or suppress him or imprison him for his beliefs. And I think the film definitely agrees with his ideological values, but with him as a person, it's surprisingly critical of him. I think he's portrayed as being somewhat pompous and egocentric, especially with regards to other campaigners who try to share the stage with him, and he very much flatly refuses, and that builds up a bit of tension between them that doesn't really go anywhere but still has quite a bit of focus in the film. And I think that was just interesting as a decision, because there could have been a way of maybe trying to sanctify him because of his opinions, and instead the film very much goes in the opposite direction. And in fact, it's especially critical about the fact that he specifically asks for no weapons to be brought to the protest. He very much wants it to be a peaceful rally. He has a lot of experience with speaking. He knows that if there are weapons there, it gives them license to be attacked in return. But what he is depicted as being somewhat ideologically naive, that he thinks that because there isn't anything there for them to be attacked, that will save them from that happening. And of course, that turns out to not be the case. And I think that the film very much is critical of that. I think that in some way, it feels that some of the damage could have been averted, maybe. I think that's definitely up for people to decide, but I thought that he was easily the most interesting figure in the film, and definitely the most developed. I think that none of the characters really get room to expand past their general archetypes. This is particularly true of the upper classes depicted in this movie, especially the magistrates that will eventually send out the order for the attack, and they are depicted in a borderline Dickensian way. They are almost chewing the scenery with how over the top they are, and I think that feels really ill-judged especially considering that Leigh tries to strive for some kind of realism, and these feel very, very caricature. One of them is actually introduced as sending a man to his death for stealing a coat. That is so over the top as an introduction, but it pretty much sets the tone, and I know that the film is in some level aware of this, because the most sort of eccentric and grandiose of them writes this incredibly flamboyant letter that gets sent to Parliament, and even they laugh at it, and I think that's meant to be some humour there, but it doesn't really work. And speaking of humour and the upper classes, the Prince Regent, played by Tim McInerney, really doesn't work. He seems to have stepped right back into Blackadder in this role, really over the top. He's only in 2 major scenes, but he's very, very playing it like he's in some sort of comedy sketch, especially in a scene very late in the film, and that comes a very jarring moment, especially because of what has just occurred on screen, the brutality of it. That juxtaposition is very much meant to be intentional, but I don't think it's quite meant to be as really jarring to the audience as it comes across on screen. It definitely feels like that comic touch to that scene shouldn't have been there. It feels like it very much exaggerates that sort of detail. I understand that the Prince Regent was particularly sort of tone deaf about what was going on, but you could have portrayed that in a slightly more subtle fashion than this film portrays it. Of course, it's all building up to that sequence at St. Peter's Field, and once that does eventually arrive, it is definitely the best section of the movie. When it comes to portraying the massacre itself, I think that Leigh does so in a way that is quite harrowing and disturbing without being overtly graphic. The film has a PG-13 or 12A rating, and I think that is a very conscious decision on Leigh's part. First of all, because he wants younger audiences to be accessible to this movie, to learn about this piece of history for themselves, but also I think that he doesn't want to overtly sensationalise what happened, which I think is something that you could potentially incur once you start lingering on the gory details of it. And there is fairly shocking imagery in amidst this sequence, and it's just distressing to watch in general, just seeing the crowd get kettled in and start getting crushed amongst themselves while the soldiers on horseback just stabbing into the crowd. It's really quite hard to watch in places without needing to linger on the death and brutality of what's happening there. I do maybe some extent agree that it does feel a little bit pared back in that regard, but not excessively so. I think that Leigh very much has the tone that he wants to portray here. What I didn't appreciate when I was watching the movie is actually the CGI work, because a lot of what you're seeing in that final section of the film is a lot of very intensive CGI work. The crowd, for example, most of the crowd are digitally duplicated because they had a very small batch of extras, but also the surrounding buildings as well. I thought they genuinely shot on location because the CGI is that good. In actuality, they only had a couple of reference buildings. Everything else has been built in a CGI location based off actual records from that time. I think the problem with Peterloo that becomes very apparent in its final moments but dogs it all the way through is just in general a lack of historical perspective. The film opens with a title caption establishing that this occurs after the Napoleonic Wars, but aside from that, if you don't know this particular part of history, I'm not sure how accessible the film is going to be for you, because it doesn't really tell you very much about these people directly, and that becomes very important in the final moments of the film, because normally films like this have captions just to give you a sense of the story in a larger scale and how events transpired afterwards. This does not do that. So at the end of the movie, after the event has occurred, you wonder what was really accomplished, what was the impact of it, the film doesn't really tell you, unfortunately. And so I think that for many viewers watching this internationally, they won't have a clue what is happening. What Leigh has made is a film that is very centric to its British audience. And that, I believe, is the reason why Amazon moved the release date. I think Peterloo works as a piece of historical recreation. If you're academically minded, if this is your subject, this is very much the film for you. But for everyone else, as a piece of entertainment, I don't think it succeeds at that. It's far too dry, there's not a strong enough narrative, and I don't think it's accessible enough. I do think that a lot of people will find this very hard going just to get to the end, and that really is a shame, because Leigh's goal was quite noble, I think, trying to raise the profile of this event that I don't think is nearly talked about enough, and I think that just by making the film, he has succeeded at that. But I do think that in general, his ambitions have overwhelmed him here. It's certainly not among his very best work, unfortunately. And what I suspect this movie's future is going to be is as a teaching aid in classrooms everywhere. But the thing is, they're not going to be watching the first 2 hours, they're just going to be watching the last 20. And that pretty much should have been what Leigh should have stuck towards. Peterloo is unarguably the most grandiose production that Mike Leigh has done to date, but it also shows the limits of his improvisational style. Now charting a historical event as opposed to intimate character pieces, the film struggles to find its bearings as it lacks crucial anchors for the audience to become invested in its overly expansive cast, aside from Kinnear when Henry Hunt becomes prominent in the second half. It's also tremendously overlong, often introducing characters during lengthy and repetitive protest meetings that impede the film from building the sense of damning anger and criticism that Leigh clearly feels about the subject. Once the titular event occurs, it is harrowingly portrayed, and the historical accuracy is commendable for a timely, if overlooked, episode, but it feels like a dry reconstruction than something widely accessible. If you like this review, then you can march over to my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.